to this episode of the North Carolina Division of State Historic Sites, Healing on the Land. I'm Tom Muir, your Historic Site Manager at the Thomas Wolfe Memorial State Historic Site in Asheville, North Carolina. And today's program is titled Asheville, Thomas Wolfe, and the Spanish Influenza. This project is made possible by an NC Cares Humanities Relief Grant from the North Carolina Humanities Council that was awarded to the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. Funding for NC Cares has been provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act Economic Stabilization Plan. Born at Asheville, October 3rd, 1900, many consider Thomas Wolfe to be North Carolina's most famous author. Wolfe's fiction captures a significant slice of time in North Carolina history. Some of it is filled with darkness and loneliness, hospitals, sanitariums, disease and death, family dysfunction and alcoholism. His father, a stonecutter, carved slabs of death. His mother, a businesswoman who saw no money in dying. To Julia Wolfe, people she thought died too slowly. Yet in 1900, the average person could expect to live only to 47 years of age. The leading causes of death were pneumonia and influenza. Often this diagnosis was confused with the number 3 killer, tuberculosis, also called the artist disease, the white plague, scrofula, consumption, or phthisis. By the late 1800s, sanitariums designated for the treatment of lung ailments were being built in various temperate locations throughout the country. When the railroad was completed to Asheville in 1880, the region's largest city found itself host to thousands of tuberculosis sufferers. It has been conservatively estimated that in the years around 1900, 450 Americans died of tuberculosis every day, over 165,000 annually. By 1916, the Asheville City Directory lists 65 physicians and 3 hospitals. Western North Carolina was rapidly becoming a world center for the treatment of tuberculosis. This was attributed to the climate theory. It was believed that ample sunshine, low humidity, and higher altitudes could remedy lung ailments. At first, the sick stayed in boarding houses that featured open-air sleeping porches, and then independent sanitariums began to spread, first on the outskirts of town, and then into the middle. At age 8, selling the Saturday Evening Post magazine on the streets of Asheville, Thomas Wolfe writes, he would make the long circle on the hills and in the woods along the outskirts, visiting the tubercular sanitariums, selling the magazines easily and quickly. By the time Wolfe published his first book, Look Homeward Angel, in 1929, there were over 24 sanitariums in the area with an estimated 900 beds. The idea behind sanitariums was to provide as much rest and food to the patient as possible, allowing the body to heal itself. Despite its reputation as a place for healing and health, nothing could prepare Asheville for the Spanish influenza, a novel virus unlike any that had been encountered up to the time. It attacked the lungs, filled them with fluid. The virus was also known as the Blue Death, as infected lungs could not supply oxygen to the victim's blood. The first case in the state was recorded September 19, 1918 in Wilmington. Within a week, the city reported more than 500 cases. The virus moved quickly westward via railroad lines. Just 9 days later, on September 28th, the first recognized case was reported in Asheville. A 27-year-old housewife, Mary Carland of South Asheville, died September 30th. On October 3rd, North Carolina Governor Thomas Bickett warned the public to stay home, to not congregate in public places. Each county was charged with deciding for itself what measures to put into place. On October 5th, Buncombe County health officials ordered people to not assemble in churches and to avoid other public gatherings. While official statistics were not made available to the public, the word on the street was at least 800 cases were in the city, with 20 deaths. Local doctor Henry Bascom Weaver told the newspaper that there was no danger of a widespread epidemic in Asheville, as the virus could not thrive in the mountains like on the East Coast. The October 13th Asheville Citizen newspaper called for volunteer help. The story declared, "Our people are suffering for lack of attention as never before. More Asheville people are dying of influenza at home than are dying from all causes on the battlefields of France." Eventually, the estimated death toll from the Spanish flu in North Carolina would be about 13,700. In the United States, 675,000, with the death toll highest in the cities. Our first guest today is Thomas Calder, who currently serves as the arts and cultural editor at the Mountain Express weekly newspaper. He is well known in Asheville for his history archive column. There, you will find that he has researched and published a series about the Spanish influenza. Thomas received his MFA in fiction from the University of Houston's creative writing program. His writing has appeared in Gulf Coast, a literary and fine arts magazine, the University of Louisville's Miracle Monocle, and elsewhere. We're excited to share the news that his debut novel, The Wind Under the Door, comes out on March 23rd, 2021. So let's welcome Thomas Calder.
Hey, Tom, thanks for that sweet intro, and thank you for having me participate. I'm really excited to talk about the series, the 1918 influenza series, which I kind of was researching near the start of the COVID outbreak last year as a way to kind of look at the potential parallels and certainly the parallels that came up during the research and over the last year itself. So thank you very much for thinking about me and asking me to join this. I'm honored to be here.
From your research, how would you describe Asheville's initial response to the Spanish flu in 1918?
Yeah, so it seems like the city responded pretty quickly. The first person diagnosed, that occurred on September 28th of 1918, and shortly thereafter, city officials were closing down churches, schools, theaters. But even with these measures in place, by October 8th, there were, I believe, there was 115 new cases. The Red Cross came in. They set up a temporary emergency hospital in a couple of locations, including the Masonic Temple. That one's particularly interesting because obviously this is during Jim Crow, so segregated society, but the Masonic Temple was housing African-American community members who were sick. And then from there, there's a lot of things that happen in those first couple of months. In mid-October, there's this really funny article that comes out in the local paper, October 16th, and they're talking about how the local kids were confused and upset by the adults because they saw them wearing these masks, and they thought the adults were trying to get an early crack at Halloween. They were wearing medical masks to prevent spreading and obviously breathing in the influenza virus. So the newspaper was commenting on this, how the kids were confused, but then it says by midday, and I'm quoting here, quote, "The site had lost its novelty. Wearers are expected to multiply now that the ice has been broken." Um, so presumably there weren't many other articles about masks in particular, but presumably more people began wearing these masks to protect themselves and others against the influenza. By October 31st, Halloween was canceled, though the paper reported there were some small groups of boys trying to, gather for the holiday. And then kind of like today, by early November, the community was getting a little antsy. By then, the shutdown had been going on for over a month. Even the paper itself was kind of overly optimistic. There's a November 10th headline that says, "An epidemic conquered." And then the paper goes on to speculate about how things will start reopening and we'll return to our new normal. This is in 1918, not now. However, by November 21st, the paper reports 1,652 cases and 42 deaths outside of the city and surrounding towns. And then in the city, there were 4,129 cases and 120 deaths. And at this point in time, Asheville's population is around 30,000. So that's November 21st. And yet by November 24th, because of the pressure from the community, they decide to allow churches to reopen. And I believe schools and theaters were also reopening. But they were encouraging those who attended church to not sing to avoid potential spread. And unfortunately, within a week after that opening, on December 1st, 1918, the Sunday Citizen reported 32 new cases within a 24-hour span. And I'm going to read a little passage from that article. The article continued, quote, "The health department states that the increase in the number of cases is undoubtedly due to the numerous gatherings and meetings of various kinds that were held this last week. When it was announced that churches, schools, and theaters would reopen, the board states that the majority of the people took it for granted that all epidemic danger had passed and governed themselves accordingly. The health officials said little last night, but they looked grave." So that kind of gives you a good idea of the city's response, how they first were, enthusiastic about stopping the spread, and then they got a little antsy, and then they kind of started seeing the numbers uptick because of the fact that they kind of relaxed a little too much. So that's kind of the first 3 months of the 1918 influenza.
One of your articles references a connection between local flu restrictions and prohibition.
Yeah, so this was kind of a fun thing to research. A little background: in 1907, Asheville voted to go dry. So at this point, there's no hard liquor in the city, it's illegal. And on October 8th, a man by the name of October 8th, 1918, I should say, not 1907, 1918, during the influenza, a man by the name of Thomas Thompson gets arrested because he's found with 2 gallons of whiskey. And he states that he had the whiskey on him as for medicinal purposes. He was worried about catching influenza. And then he goes on to point out that he was also discovered with some herbs. And he said that just goes to show you, basically, I'm paraphrasing here, but that I had serious medical concerns, and that's why I had these 2 items on my person when I was arrested. And the judge doesn't buy it, and he says, "I think you had the herbs to conceal the stench of whiskey." And he fines this character, Thomas Thompson, $150, which would have been around 2,500 in today's currency. He also destroys Mr. Thompson's 2 gallons of whiskey, and then he bans him from the state. He tells him to get out of the state by the next morning. And then there's one other piece, actually, the same article referencing the masks and Halloween That article also just mentioned how flasks were becoming fashionable again. They'd been out of use, obviously, for several years because of the fact that Asheville was dry. But according to the paper, folks were now using flasks to hold their mouthwash, to disinfect, because they were concerned about, obviously, influenza. Whether or not it was mouthwash or perhaps just some of Thomas Thompson's whiskey in those flasks, I do not know. But that was a funny little article to find too, just the fact that people were carrying flasks during that time.
Did you find examples of exploitation of local citizens related to the pandemic?
So yeah, kind of like the whiskey story, the exploitation was fun to research as well. I wasn't anticipating that, but there were several ads taken out early on. Some of them were pretty innocent. Some of them were just downright misleading. But there was one, and I've got some notes over here, but there was one from Asheville's Central Bank, and I'm going to read some quotes here, that they were warning residents of a common and costly disease spreading across America, and they called it financial influenza. And according to the bank, the virus's chief symptoms were, and I quote, a frequent desire to buy something one doesn't need. And those afflicted with this financial influenza experienced, quote, an aching void in the interior of the pocketbook. So naturally, the remedy for this was to open a savings account at Central Bank. That was one of the more lighthearted ones. There's also a local the Asheville Bootery that was advertising that good leather shoes would keep your feet dry, and that was a surefire way to avoid influenza. There was a drugstore that was kind of promoting their high ceilings for good ventilation. So it's safe to come in here. We've got great ventilation. You don't have to worry. All doctors agree that ventilation is the best way to avoid catching it. And then there was a man whose name most people will recognize, E.W. Grove, who built the Grove Park Inn, the Battery Park Hotel, the Grove Arcade. Source of his original wealth was in pharmaceuticals, and he still had the Paris Medicine Company, and they were taking out ads in the paper that were dismissing the influenza. They were just calling it an exaggerated form of grippe. And they had these advertisements that were claiming that their product, Grove's laxative bromo Q9, was a preventative as long as you took it in larger doses. So I guess if you bought more and you took more, you should be fine from influenza. Don't worry about it. But the strangest ad, it was a testimonial in the October 24th, 1918 article in the Asheville Citizen. It was this West Virginia company that was claiming that if you breathe in fumes of formaldehyde mixed with ethyl alcohol and water, it would heal those suffering from influenza. And I think, by the end of October, on October 27th, the paper has this headline that kind of gives you an idea of what it was like at that time. The headline read, Public Health Service issues warning against cures for influenza. So yes, there were plenty of people trying to exploit the health crisis to either sell products or just, encourage people to consider things unrelated to the influenza, like opening a savings account.
When did Asheville begin to ease restrictions related to the flu?
So it kind of came in a couple of waves. The first one was November of 1918. That's when they started reopening churches, schools, theaters. But then by the start of 1919, with the numbers kind of upticking, the city health official, Carl V. Reynolds, did a partial shutdown, which actually created a little more agitation than the original shutdown, just because it felt a little arbitrary. He allowed churches, schools, and theaters to remain open, but fraternal and social gatherings were prohibited. And part of the stipulation was, teachers were encouraged to basically question their students each morning. Have you been around anybody with a cough? Have you had a temperature, fever? And then theaters were prohibited from selling tickets to anybody with a cold or a cough. And I don't remember seeing any specific guidelines for the churches. But some union leaders got really upset by this. They felt like it was kind of arbitrary. One person wrote into the paper, like, if teachers can play doctor, why can't we play doctor too, and just ask our members if they've been sick or exposed. And Reynolds eventually responds by going into a full shutdown mode again. So all things are closed. And that would run until February 12th of 1919. And kind of like the first time, there was a little more resistance the second shutdown in general, because I mean, there's fatigue. We've seen this episode before. We don't want to do that again. But by and large, most people kind of abided by it. There were some nasty letters about Reynolds just because of his kind of back and forth on his decision making. More is lost through indecision than wrong decision, as Tony Soprano once said in The Sopranos. But in the end, residents seemed to comply, and by February 12th of 1919, those restrictions were lifted, and things began to kind of return to normal.
Were there subsequent new waves of the flu? And when did it end?
So yeah, there was definitely another wave. Basically a year later, in October of 1919, there's late October, and on October 25th, there's reports of outbreaks in surrounding communities. But oddly enough, the Asheville Citizen writes that residents in the city were, and I'm quoting here, quote, practically immune from the disease, end quote. Nevertheless, the paper was advising readers and residents to, remain alert, don't put their guard down, avoid potential exposure. And for good reason, because for a while things seemed to go okay, but by January 1920, the paper reported 232 new cases within a 24-hour period. And as they did with the previous outbreaks, both in 1918 and then at the start of 1919 and 1920, they have one more shutdown. Churches, schools, theaters, everything closes. Over 2,000 residents would be infected in that 1920 outbreak, resulting in 31 deaths. And this took place over a 5-week period. But after that 5-week period in February, as the winter started to wane and the warmer weather was coming, it does seem like, obviously restrictions were lifted, and folks returned to the new normal. Churches opened, theaters, schools, and there were no subsequent reports after that 5-week period at the start of 1920 of any major influenza outbreaks in Asheville. So it seems like they turned the corner there into basically the Roaring 20s.
Thank you, Thomas Calder. Our next guest, Terry Roberts, is a native of the mountains of Western North Carolina, born and bred. Currently, Terry Roberts is the director of the National Paideia Center. He is a lifelong teacher and educational reformer. Roberts earned a PhD in American literature from UNC Chapel Hill, and his literary pursuits have included editing the Thomas Wolfe Review for 10 years. A member of the Thomas Wolfe Society since graduate school in the late 1980s, and currently president of the group, he has written many articles about Thomas Wolfe and resource volumes about Wolfe's Look Homeward Angel. Terry is the author of 3 celebrated novels: A Short Time to Stay Here, winner of the Willie Morris Prize for Southern Fiction and the Sir Walter Raleigh Award for Fiction; That Bright Land, winner of the Thomas Wolfe Memorial Literary Award, the James Still Award for writing about the Appalachian South, and the Sir Walter Raleigh Award for Fiction. And more recently, The Holy Ghost Speakeasy and Revival, a finalist for the 2019 Sir Walter Raleigh Award for Fiction. We are also excited to announce his fourth novel, My Mistress's Eyes Are Raven Black, will be released in July of 2021. Welcome, Terry Roberts.
Thank you so much. It's a delight to be with you today and to talk about what may seem like a grim subject, the death of Ben Gantt, a character in Thomas Wolfe's famous novel, Look Homeward Angel. But on the other hand, there are several reasons why that scene is so profoundly moving and important, never more so than today when we're suffering from a worldwide pandemic. Not terribly unlike the flu pandemic of 100 years ago. As a writer and as a reader, I've been engaged with Thomas Wolfe since my 20s. I've served as the editor of the Thomas Wolfe Review. I've read countless articles, written countless articles, some not so great, about Look Homeward Angel and about the way in which Wolfe studies the history of Asheville. His book, his first novel, Look Homeward Angel, was published in 1929, as I mentioned a moment ago, to rave critical reviews outside North Carolina. Inside North Carolina, there was a good deal of consternation, in part because Wolfe told the truth about his experience growing up in Asheville from the time he was born in 1900 until he left around his 16th birthday to go to the University of North Carolina. And in telling the truth, he told it in a way that was graphic, that was sensual, and that was moving. And so it goes beyond history in a sense. It goes beyond history in the way that a great historical novel teaches us the human side of history. And so on the one hand, you can read Look Homeward Angel as a historical document, and many have done so, as well as reading in a number of other ways as well. But when you do, you're introduced into what one might call the intimate history of Thomas Wolfe and his family, because, of course, the novel is profoundly autobiographical. And so if you want to know what history feels like, smells like, sounds like on the street, in the back room, in a crowded home, then you read Thomas Wolfe. And in that way, you're introduced to an Asheville that you don't get from the more formal history books.
Tell us about the nature of Thomas Wolfe's first novel as an historical document.
I mentioned a minute ago that this was the sensuous or sensual history of Asheville and Chapel Hill in the first quarter century of the last century, the 1900s. I want to say a little bit more about that. One of the things that I think is extremely important about reading Look Homeward Angel as a historical document is that when it was published, it didn't have that feel. Wolfe was writing in many ways about his own life, his own childhood, his own adolescence, and how he experienced his family, as well as the town of Asheville, North Carolina, named Altamont in the novel. And so if you pick this book up in 1929, particularly if you lived in Asheville, you could go through and in the margins write the, quote, real names of so many of the characters who appear there, the real locations of events that are described. You could have taken a map of the city and stuck Look Homeward Angel pins in the map because you would have known it because you had lived it. But the significant thing is that it's now 100 years later, almost 100 years later, lacking a few years since the novel's publication. It now feels like history because there is no one currently living who would have experienced those events firsthand. One of the reasons this is so important is that it's a historical record. In a way, it's a kind of fictional primary document. And I know that's a contradiction in terms for formal historians, but it's a way of entering the emotional life of a profoundly sensitive child and adolescent who was alive during a period in Asheville's history that has become increasingly important to us 100 years later, in part because he captures so much of the history of Asheville that still matters today. For example, the real estate crash that occurred in Asheville, not in 1929, but in 1930, when his mother lost almost everything. And as another example, the influenza epidemic of 1918, 1919, and 1920, which culminates in the death of his brother. All of these events were real. They had occurred within the lifetime of the people who first read this novel upon its publication. To us, however, it holds up a mirror. It holds up a mirror in the sense that history often teaches us about the present moment. And in this particular case, it teaches us about the impact of worldwide economic collapse pending. It's coming, although you see it in the novel was published in October 1929, the year of the stock market crash, and the month of the stock market crash. The events in the novel cover many of the events that are eerily unlike those that we're living through now. For example, a worldwide pandemic. It occurred between world wars. Eugene is very interested in trying to serve in World War I, as was his brother Ben, at a time when our own culture is full of cultural and economic and even religious conflict. And so it's a novel, in a sense, about us, as all great history is about us.
What was the impact of death and illness on Wolfe's family in the early 20th century as seen in Look Homeward, Angel?
There are essentially three deaths which haunt Wolfe's family as he describes it in Look Homeward, Angel. And of those three, two occur during the period of time described in the novel. The third, the death of his father, doesn't occur before the novel ends around 1920, the time period of the novel. That will come shortly thereafter. But the strange thing is that the death of Wolfe's father, W.O. Wolfe, in the novel, W.O. Gantt, actually hangs over about the last fourth of the book because he's seriously ill with prostate cancer at a time when it was almost impossible to deal with prostate cancer. He had a kind of death sentence, if you will, and he becomes a sort of living ghost by the end of the book. So that's one of the three deaths I'm talking about. The other two are Wolfe's brothers. The first, they were twins, Grover Cleveland Wolfe, known as Grover Gantt in the book, and Benjamin Harrison Wolfe, Grover's twin brother, known as Ben Gantt in the novel. These two brothers are among, in many ways, the best of the family's offspring. Now, of course, they are romanticized in a sense, as all families do, want people they have lost, individual family members they've lost. Grover dies at a relatively young age while the family is at the World's Fair in St. Louis, when Eliza is running a boarding house in St. Louis. When Eugene Gantt, Thomas Wolfe's sort of face in the book, his protagonist, autobiographical protagonist, Eugene is still a small boy, and so he remembers Grover, but not well. As he matures in a family that is just dysfunctional, doesn't do us justice. The two parents were almost at emotional and psychological war from the beginning. The children tend to divide themselves up into two teams. You're either Gantt or Pentland, meaning you're for and like the father or for and like the mother. Eugene is caught between these two strong personalities and these two sort of family ecosystems, if you will. And so's Ben. Ben is the one character in the family, as it's described in the novel, who actually is a kind of Switzerland, as we say. He's a neutral zone between these two strong, compelling, warring forces inside this family. Ben is also the character who comes closest within the family to understanding Eugene, the budding artist, who is so sensitive, so thoughtful, so full of language, and so different. He's almost, in a way, kind of freakish within his family. And yet his brother Ben is the one family member who seems to understand that and appreciate him. He understands, as it were, Eugene's inner life, the buried life of Look Homeward Angel. And because of that, Eugene keeps turning again and again to Ben Gantt throughout the novel. And so when Ben sickens and dies in 1918, the fall of 1918, both in the book as he did in real life, when Ben dies, there's a sense in which that's Eugene's last tie to his family, and in many ways to Asheville. He'll return to Asheville from time to time after that, while he's in graduate school at Harvard, and then later on when he's living in New York. But by and large, all of a sudden, Eugene's tether, both to Asheville and to his family, has been severed by the loss of his beloved brother. And so there is a very real sense in which you could summarize Look Homeward Angel as a profound early 20th century American novel as being about three profound things. One, life, the nature of life. Two, death, because of the three deaths I've just described. And then three, family. We often joke that Sigmund Freud should have been assigned Look Homeward Angel as a case study just so he could take a look at Eugene Gantt / Thomas Wolfe's family, because it is extraordinarily dramatic.
When does the Spanish flu appear in the novel, Look Homeward Angel?
The Spanish flu appears in chapters 35 through 37, and chapter 40 is the last chapter in the novel. So these chapters are quite close to the end. I mentioned before that Ben Gantt's death from the Spanish flu might be considered in some ways the climax of the novel. And those three chapters, Eugene is a student at Chapel Hill, called Pulpit Hill in the novel. He comes home because he gets a telegram that his brother is grievously ill from pneumonia. The only reference, as far as I know, within those chapters to the Spanish flu per se, is that when he enters Ben's, the room in the house, the old Kentucky home, where Ben is lying in bed, dying, as it becomes obvious, Ben looks up and he sees Eugene, and he gasps out, "Why are you here, Gene? Why are you here?" And the best lie that Eugene can come up with in this terribly fraught moment is to say, "I've come home because they've closed the university due to the flu." That line appears in the autobiographical notes that became Look Homeward Angel. It appears in the novel. And essentially, that's the only place where we get this reference that they're aware that this is a worldwide pandemic, that this is sweeping the country. Historically, and I think Tom discussed this and your earlier guest, the flu really only appeared in America in the spring of 1918, and this is only October. And so this has happened very quickly at a time period, of course, when they're unaware in the beginning of what's going on. They think it might be tuberculosis. They think it might be pneumonia. Ben is already particularly subject to this because he's a heavy smoker. He's very much underweight. He's got weak lungs, perhaps because of tuberculosis in his past. So he's vulnerable. And so what I'd like to say about this in particular is that the death of Ben Gantt in this novel may be the greatest death scene in American literature. And by that, I mean the most moving, the most complex, the most dramatic death scene. No less a reader and a writer than Pat Conroy, the famous novelist that we lost not that long ago, was adamant about the fact that the death of Ben Gantt is indeed the greatest death scene in American literature, and he always measured his own attempts to describe death against Wolfe's description of losing his brother, and always failed, because in a sense it's almost monumental. Now, what this means to us 100 years later, when we're in the middle of our own horrific worldwide pandemic, COVID-19, we don't yet and may never have a literary scene that captures for us the reality of one of those individual deaths, as Wolfe captured the death of a single individual and its horrific impact on the family during the Spanish influenza epidemic of 1918 through 20. So what I'm saying is, we mentioned earlier that this is history brought home. This is emotional history, sensuous history, dramatic history, and in a sense, very personal history. And so, as tragic a scene as this is, and as horrific, as I said earlier, the impact on Wolfe's family, the Gantt family in the novel, it gives us the gut level sense of what this must have been like. It puts a face, if you will, on history, the Spanish influenza epidemic. So there are many photographs that we have of the attempts to stop the spread of the flu in 1918, 19, and 20 in America, as well as in other parts of the world. But in this case, we've got a photograph or a picture in words by one of America's greatest writers. And so it gives us, in addition to all the historical statistics and all the black and white photographs from the era, it gives us a very real, visceral sense of what it was like to watch someone under very, we would think of as very rudimentary medical conditions, die at home of the Spanish flu. And because of that, it's something that makes it real. It can make history real. And it matters to us now so profoundly because we're caught up in a kind of repetition of that worldwide event, that global tragedy. And because of that, we're able to, I think, look back and experience something in a way we couldn't have experienced it before if Thomas Wolfe had never written this novel. One can only hope that somewhere around the world, there's a great writer who will address our current pandemic in the same way that Wolfe addressed the 1918 through 20 influenza pandemic.
Tell us about the death of Benjamin Wolfe and how it can be used as a teachable moment.
I think the profound lesson in the death of Ben Gantt and, of course, historically Ben Wolfe is that we are very fragile creatures, that we are not immortal, at least in the way we live life on this earth, and that this family, the historical family of Thomas Wolfe and the family of Eugene Gantt in the novel, is at war with one another through most of the book. And yet, when they lose Ben, there is a moment immediately following his death when all of them together, collectively, those who were present, feel a kind of relief, but also a kind of reminder of their value to each other. I'm going to read two short paragraphs about the Gantt family as described by Thomas Wolfe. This is immediately following the loss of the son, who is still upstairs in the room at the memorial in bed, who has just passed away. They were tired, Wolfe writes, but they all felt an enormous relief. For over a day, each had known that death was inevitable. And after the horror of the incessant strangling gasp, this peace, this end of pain touched them all with a profound, a weary joy. And then a few lines further down, they stood there together without speaking in Eliza's littered kitchen, and their eyes were blind with tears because they thought of lovely and delicate death and because they loved one another. I think the thing we take away, or that we should take away, is that life is fragile, much more fragile probably than in our egocentric Western way we would have wanted to believe, and that those whom we love, we often take for granted. We think that we'll always have them. And I think one of the things that this does is taught Eugene Gantt in the novel, taught Thomas Wolfe as an artist, and maybe 100 years later it can teach us as well, that we must treasure those whom we love, we must value them, and we must find a way, where we can, when we can, to show them how extraordinarily significant they are as an individual human being, but also to us as individuals, so that there is a way in which death teaches us to value life. And for me, I think the very visceral nature of this particular scene from this powerful classic American novel shows us that we have a kind of responsibility to each other to seek to know and to cherish the inner lives of those whom we love.
So thank you, Thomas and Terry. You are both true friends of Thomas Wolfe and North Carolina historic sites. As we have just witnessed, throughout the history of North Carolina, our citizens have struggled with darkness and disease. The toll has often led to revolutions in medicine, changes in local politics, and inspired our art and literature. We hope you will discover through this and other episodes of Healing on the Land how these historic struggles and triumphs can provide us valuable lessons to teach contemporary audiences navigating the current pandemic and help prepare us for the future and life after COVID-19. As will the corona pandemic, the Spanish flu ended by April of 1920, and we learned the advice passed down from our ancestors, and we constantly reiterate that advice today. Wear a mask, maintain social distancing, wash hands frequently, cough into elbows, stay home when sick. Thank you for sharing your time with us today, and please be well.